Mandy was really outgoing. She was an amazing person. She taught me how to ride bikes, and we played dolls and went on trips to Tennessee.
Mandy was very quirky. She was always being funny, being more silly than funny. You know what I mean? She always tried to make you laugh. That was how she came across. She had a real personality. My grandfather was a pastor of our local church. We went to church. It was like Wednesday night Bible study, Saturday night, choir practice, Sunday morning service, night service. So that was a big part of our weeks. This is Mandy's baptizing photo. She was like 15 or 16 there. I did feel like we were sheltered a little much. Dating and boys, that was not something that they did in the church.
Mandy was not allowed to have any boyfriends growing up. Papa was very strict on that.
You didn't have those relations until you were married. That's something in all churches around here. That's in this whole community.
It was a very strict way of growing up. Couldn't do much of what you wanted. You had to make sure you lived by the Bible. If you didn't, it was a sin.
Paul LeMay met Mandy online. They met on Facebook. Paul LeMay came down to Eastern Kentucky by way of Massachusetts. I think Paul was very smitten by Mandy. I think he was very attracted to the idea that a woman so far away wanted him, and that's what precipitated his relocation to Eastern Kentucky.
The trouble was, she knew nothing of him.
Paul was older. He was 47 or 48. He'd already lived life, so in her mind, she thought he was smarter about things.
Mandy liked that he was different, not from around here. Paul would come every other weekend to come take her to church.
Paul was portrayed to me as a religious person and a good guy. He was this big Christian guy who was really nice. I was happy for her. She had said that they had things in common, that they could actually talk to each other for a long time. She seemed happy, and that made me happy.
They dated about 7 months at the most. And then they got married.
From what she had told me, the reason she married Paul so quick was because they were trying to do things right. It was just a little small wedding, just a few people from that church that they went to.
It was a 15-minute ceremony. It wasn't nothing fancy. My grandparents thought it was a good thing, too, to get married to Paul. They liked that he had a job, could provide for her, and had 2 vehicles.
Paul didn't have much family nearby. None of his family was there, I know that. Looking back, that was very weird to me. I've personally never met none of Paul's family.
Paul LeMay has this mysterious past where we don't know a lot about his background, and that may be by design. It's possible that he doesn't want Mandy or her family or anybody to know a lot about him. It's interesting because we have someone who, on one hand, has estranged or distant relationships from family members, but on the other hand, has an identified loved one that they've idolized. It sets itself up for problems in the future.
Paul and Mandy lived in Oil Springs, Sayersville, Kentucky. Just a little town, a little back road. Paul, he worked at a nursing home, and he brought home the money.
He paid for the home that they lived in.
She didn't have to work at all, Mandy didn't. He made sure she had everything she needed, didn't let her go without. At first, Paul seemed like a good man, from what I seen anyway.
But sometimes Paul would say a lot of negative things on Facebook. That may have been his way to get his point across, was through social media. Say the things on there that he couldn't say in person.
It's a Facebook post from Paul. All my life I've been called no good, that I'm worthless, that I will never amount to anything. I finally had enough and I came here to Kentucky, where I've got myself a home that I paid for. I have a beautiful, loving wife, and anyone says otherwise, they are a liar.
He was very fragile. I could see that. He never opened up, wouldn't talk. Maybe there was a reason behind it. There was a madness in his old life that I didn't know about.
Paul LeMay's Facebook posts say to me that this is someone who's vulnerable and identifies with this role of someone who's been victimized and has to take on the world.
At the time, me and my husband had separated. My children were tiny. Mandy, she's like, if you want to, you can come here, you can stay with me and Paul. She's like, we can spend time together, get back to being sisters. And so in my mind, it was an awesome idea because I loved Mandy. She was my best friend.
Mandy, she loved her hair dye. She started dyeing her hair crazy colors. It was blue, purple, and one time she messed it up and it was half blonde, half blue.
One time we were gonna dye both of our hair that same night. And we was gonna go out and get the hair dyed. And Paul wouldn't allow us to do it. Paul, it wasn't a necessary thing, so she wasn't allowed to do it.
Why was that?
I don't know why he wouldn't allow her to do it. I'm trying to answer these for you, but I can't find a rhyme to the reason of why he wouldn't let her. I suppose he treated her like a child.
The fact that Paul LeMay's relationship with Mandy appears to be more like that of a father and a daughter is indicative of his controlling nature. It's also interesting that in this day and age, where social media and videos of one another are very common, that there's actually very little of that with Paul LeMay and Mandy. If he can control the little day-to-day tasks that she does, he can ultimately control her life.
Paul would work and he would come home and I would say, hi, Paul. He would say hello, and that was it. He would always lock himself in his bedroom.
folks who are quiet and brooding and kind of seething underneath, those are the folks that you may least expect, but who could prove to be the most dangerous.
He would always lock himself in his bedroom. I thought it was weird. He wouldn't associate with the rest of us. Nobody really knew what was going on in there. Paul could be quiet, Paul could be shy. Behind closed doors, Paul could be a creep. He would lock himself in there like a hermit crab. One time she had opened the door and asked him what he wanted for supper, and he told her, "I don't care what we have for supper, I don't care if we effing eat or not." In my mind, she was trying to take care of him and do what a wife should be doing for a husband. And he was straight up disrespectful to her.
This is Mandy at a rough time. About 25, probably. This looks like the time she had gotten arguments with Paul.
A lot of the times they would argue. They would argue in the bedroom, in their room. And we tried to stay away from that because I had kids and I didn't want them to hear that. So we always tried to stay out of the arguments. It was always behind that bedroom door. Mandy would go in her room, she would come back out and she'd be like, "Oh, it's happened again." Paul, he's in one of his moods.
But she chose to stay.
I don't know why she chose to stay, but I think a lot of it is that she was actually building a home and building a life. And it's just like, to her, it was nothing. Like she'd grown used to it.
There's indication that the arguments between Paul and Mandy are escalating. It begs the question of, what's happening there. Is it that he feels he's losing control and his own insecurity is knocking at the door? When someone like Paul doesn't feel in control, he may lash out impulsively.
One day we was going up to see Mom, and we had made it from Sayersville to Prestonsburg, and we made it that far before he had called her on his break, and there was a heated argument to the point that she pulled over and we turned around and went back. Anytime Mandy had to do anything, she had to run it by Paul and make sure Paul was okay with it. He had come home from work and he said he wasn't feeling good, so he went in there and he laid down and went to sleep. And so me and Mandy and the kids had went out to Walmart. And he was so mad when we come back because she had left without saying something to him that she actually went into the room and wasn't allowed back. She didn't come back out that night.
Here's a situation where Paul is about 20 years older than Mandy, yet he has effectively grounded her. When individuals are that controlling and domineering, it makes you wonder what else is happening behind closed doors.
Felt like she was trapped in a prison. Mandy would say things like, "I feel like I'm in jail sometimes," Paul was very controlling. The last 2 or 3 months that I stayed there, we didn't really go anywhere or do anything. Pretty much the only thing he allowed Mandy to do was to do the grocery shopping.
He wouldn't let her go anywhere and do anything or see anyone. But when she stopped coming around, I knew something was up.
Several times I told Mandy that she didn't have to put up with that. She could leave, but she never would listen. It's like it was her relationship. I needed to butt out of it. It wasn't any of my business. Me and the kids would stay in that room on the opposite side from where her and Paul would stay. We just kept them back there unless they needed to come out and use the bathroom. It was like we were walking on eggshells, so to speak, tiptoeing around the house. I wish I would have stepped in and done something because I feel like I could have helped her out. And I wish I'd just let her know that I cared more, you know what I mean? I wish I got her out of there.
Paul is this quiet fella who keeps to himself. But as time goes on, his Facebook posts start to get more aggressive.
Last night was a tough night. I cried most of the night. The enemy wanting me to do something, but I was strong enough not to do it. Hopefully today is a better day. Now I kind of beat myself up for not putting them on my Facebook. I've never seen these. It just hurts me. I've not seen those.
From a religious perspective, Paul may be referring to the enemy as Satan. It's also possible that the enemy is his rage, his insecurity. This is an example of an individual who seems to be fighting to control their behavior.
This Facebook post is Paul is really trying to bury those demons and keep himself from crossing that line from verbal aggression to physical aggression.
Had I seen this at the time, I'd been angry. I'd tried to help her.
It begs the question, what kind of threats could Paul LeMay have been making behind closed doors? Regardless of which way we go, we're heading into the abyss. Things are about to get worse.
One day, one of the kids had climbed up on the table and had knocked over a couple of plates and cups that was sitting on the table from when they were eating. Paul, he didn't really explode or anything. He went into the room, he had hollered for Mandy to come in there, and I don't know what was happening to Mandy. Like I said, she was in that room, they were locked in there, I don't know. They were in there for over an hour, and when they came out, they had got a change or two of clothes for each one of them, and she told me that they'd be back. That's when Paul and Mandy had left there. I could tell something was wrong. It's not often my sister calls me crying. She told me she was scared for him to be around the kids. If I didn't get the kids out of there before they got back, that something was gonna happen. He might hurt them or something.
There's increasing evidence that Paul LeMay is becoming unraveled. That's particularly worrisome because individuals who threaten or hurt children tend to lack remorse and empathy for others.
It did kind of scare me at that point. So the best thing for me to do for my kids was to leave. When I left there with the kids, things with Paul and Mandy got a lot worse.
The trouble was, Paul would act normal sometimes. Sometimes he didn't seem like a bad guy at all. He was nice, he was polite. To me, it was strange.
We're seeing this Jekyll and Hyde personality. We have someone who's on one hand saying, Mandy, I love you, my beautiful wife. And on the other hand, someone who is controlling her, potentially threatening children, not giving her money to go to the store. So we see these two diametrically opposed personality behaviors, and that's actually quite common in individuals who perpetrate interpersonal violence.
There was a couple months after I moved out, she was telling me that he was getting a lot more aggressive. She was telling me that Paul was starting to be more physical with her. Started out with him shoving her. And then it got to where he would get in her face and he would get more violent with her. She said she was scared that if she didn't get out of there, that she wouldn't get out of there. She called me and told me she did leave Paul. She was at a friend's house, that she was scared of him and that she didn't want to go back home. She told me they were good people, she was safe. I didn't really question it. She was out of the bad situation, so in my mind, she was good. And she told me she was going to come over for Thanksgiving.
Thanksgiving is really important to our family because it's the only time we actually sit down around the table and gather around and pray over the food.
I was excited. I'm not gonna lie, it's been months since I got to see my sister, so I was excited.
The family are ready to eat Thanksgiving dinner. Dinner comes and goes, but there's no Mandy.
Nobody could get a hold of her. Nobody knew exactly where she was. I was the last one to know where she was, and she was supposed to be at that friend's house.
As the minutes turn to hours, the hours turn to days, I could imagine a whole host of thoughts, running through their head about where Mandy might be. Maybe she's in the hospital. Maybe she's just out having a good time. Maybe Mandy's gone to see somebody else for Thanksgiving, and maybe she'll turn back up.
Couldn't believe what happened next. Mandy had told me she was at a friend's house and she was safe. But then we wasn't having no luck getting hold of her. I tried contacting her phone, her Facebook, her messenger, and she just would not answer. I didn't even know where to start to go to look. I had went out and I had printed off some photos to give the state police.
The uncertainty of it all was a very terrifying moment for that family, just not knowing. Despite the family's concern over Mandy being gone for 2 to 3 weeks, on December 17, there's a post on her Facebook account.
I needed to get away from the drama and dry myself out. I will contact the ones in my family after the first of the year.
I knew reading that day that wasn't Mandy.
I love you. Please understand I'm going through hard times right now, but I will contact you after the first. Love you later.
That's words of an alcoholic. Mandy wasn't an alcoholic and didn't have to dry herself out. Everything in this is spelled exactly as it should be, down to every last apostrophe and everything, and
Mandy always spelt things very weird. Her spelling was never correct, and everything in this was right. And so, reading this when it came out, everybody knew something was wrong. Everybody knew that wasn't Mandy.
Homer then contacted Paul asking where Mandy was, what was going on. Homer asked him if it was them that posted that on there. Paul wouldn't speak back. Dad was mad. He's trying to find his sister. After a while, Paul says, I ain't heard from her in weeks either. That's when Dad got mad and called the cops.
Dispatcher Thompson.
Oh, yes, ma'am. I was wondering, how do I go about filing a missing person report?
Okay, what's going on?
Okay, my sister and her and her husband had split up, and nobody has seen her since the day before Thanksgiving.
Who is your sister?
Mandy Ann King LeMay.
Okay, and what's your name?
Homer King.
Okay, and she's married?
Yes. He's telling us that he hasn't seen her since the day before Thanksgiving either.
Okay, I'll have a trooper make contact with you, okay?
Okay, I appreciate it.
Homer was really annoyed at Paul. He was wanting to know where Mandy was, but she ain't spoke to nobody in over 3 weeks.
We know from the evidence so far that Mandy has been controlled by Paul. And the family's probably thinking maybe it's just their relationship. It's very possible that Paul has Mandy trapped inside the house.
When the trooper arrives to Mandy and Paul's residence, he goes up onto the porch. The blinds are drawn, he can't see inside the residence. He hears a series of what he describes as thumps. It sounded like someone was moving around in the home, but nobody ever came to the door. So that trooper immediately radios for backup. Paul is in fact inside the residence and is not coming out of the residence. The Kentucky State Police show up very quickly. It has escalated into a barricaded subject who's refusing to come out and respond to law enforcement commands and who is known to own a .22 caliber handgun. They were concerned that Mandy was being held inside the residence. As the Kentucky State Police are trying to get Paul LeMay to cooperate with their commands, they're looking for folks, neighbors, who might have any means to contact Paul. One of the neighbors happens to have Paul LeMay on Facebook Messenger. And Paul responds. Paul's still refusing to come out of the residence. But as the time goes on, Paul wants a cigarette. The Kentucky State Police tell Paul, you've got to come to us. Paul is very reluctant to do this. So the neighbor, Pat, volunteers to take the cigarette to Paul, who's standing on the porch. Now, at this time, when Paul comes out of the residence, Paul LeMay is dressed in nothing but sweatpants and no shirt. It's December 17 in Kentucky. It's very cold, so the next door neighbor, Pat, also offers his sweatshirt. As soon as Paul LeMay gets that sweatshirt, he is rushed by 2 troopers who were laying in wait, and that's how the Kentucky State Police eventually got Paul into custody. The state police began a sweep of the LeMay residence to look for Mandy. At that point, they had no idea whether she was dead or alive. When the troopers walked into the LeMay residence, they were met by the smell of death. They could smell decomposition in the air. When they get into this back bedroom, they can make out a pile of blankets, and sticking out from the bottom of that blanket is what is obviously a human foot. They pull the sheets back, and there they find the deceased body of Mandy LeMay. She had a single gunshot wound to the back of her head. What's clear, at this point, she had been there for quite some time.
I got a call from Daddy. He said, she's gone. She won't be coming back. I fell to the floor. My whole body was paralyzed for 3 days after that.
I never knew she went back there to even think that could have happened. I'm done. That's as far as I want to go.
A family in Johnson County is wishing they would have seen the signs after police say their family member, Mandy LeMay, was shot and killed by her husband.
Paul LeMay's statements to Kentucky State Police during his recorded interview tells us that Paul was obviously in a very troubled place.
I just want you to tell me what happened.
You know what happened. You want me to come out and say it? I'll say it. Yes, I killed her. I didn't want to. I loved the woman, damn it.
My guess is that Paul did it so that nobody else could have her, and she couldn't leave him.
It's gonna come out that I'm the bad guy no matter what. They're gonna take her side over me.
Paul clearly identifies as the victim. Individuals who fail to take responsibility for their own actions are some of the same individuals who are callous and lack empathy and remorse.
She would have been alive now if she wouldn't have went back. But Mandy couldn't make up her mind whether she loved him or not.
I'm gonna be betrayed as a monster.
You want to tell me how you done it?
We learned through the course of the investigation, Mandy had left the marital residence and hadn't returned for quite some time. But eventually, Mandy LeMay returns home.
I just sat on the couch looking at her.
She tells Paul that she's lost her telephone. She doesn't have one, and she needs a mean of communications. She wants to be able to reach out to her family and set up this plan to go spend Thanksgiving with her family, to have dinner with him.
She wanted to use a phone. She was talking to someone.
We know that Paul LeMay is in the house at that time, and he is likely hearing these conversations take place. He understands that in a few more days, when Thanksgiving rolls around, Mandy's going to be back out the door again, spending time with her family, and eventually an argument between the two ensues.
At this point, Paul knows that he's lost Mandy. He's lost control of the one person in his life, the source of his ego. And now we can see that the dark impulses are going to seep back in. It's almost like a volcano erupting. This is the last straw.
What little bit of heart I had left for her, it just went away.
The evidence in this case shows that Paul LeMay went to his bedroom.
What kind of gun was it, Paul?
A .22 revolver.
He took that revolver into the living room. He put that gun to the back of Mandy LeMay's head, and he pulled that trigger.
Well, from what I was told, he shot her in the back bedroom and dragged her to their bed, and he slept next to her those several weeks that she was laying there.
In the very end, after she died, Paul still didn't want to let her go. This is indicative of yet another final opportunity for him to control her.
I reckon Paul was trying to preserve the body because he literally slept in a freezing house next to her. So y'all had the funeral? It's hard for me to walk through the funeral doors. I walked out when I seen the casket and it was closed. I didn't even get to tell her goodbye.
I could have got Mandy out. Mandy could have been safe. Mandy could be here with us now.
It would have been nice if Mandy could have met my children more. I could explain to them better of how good of a person she was, how good of an aunt she would have been, how much they would have been spoiled. It hurts me every day that she can't be here with us today.
Paul was evaluated by 2 psychiatrists, both of whom cleared him as competent to stand trial.
You swear the testimony about to give is the truth, whole truth, and nothing but truth, so help you God.
Yeah, I do.
Your name?
Paul LeMay.
Grand jury charges that on or about November 20, 2018, you committed the death of Mandy LeMay by shooting her in the head which caused her death, that being the charge of murder. You wish to enter into a guilty plea based on the Commonwealth's offer on plea of guilt.
Yes.
If I accept your plea,
Paul LeMay didn't actually go to trial. He pleaded guilty to 1 count of murder, 1 count of abuse of a corpse.
Judge, on behalf of Mr. LeMay, he declines to make a statement other than to say that the truth that he would tell wouldn't be believed by anyone.
It's still very frustrating that he couldn't explain to everybody in court why he did do it.
And
on a quiet afternoon in Southern California, beneath the warm February sun, a 17-year-old girl stepped out of her home with nothing more than the things she had carried countless times before. Her running shoes, her phone, her determination to stay active. It was an ordinary day. A day that looked exactly like hundreds of other days in the life of Chelsea King. She was the kind of teenager people remembered for the right reasons. The kind of person whose name was usually followed by words like bright, kind, driven, and full of potential. She was not someone who searched for danger. She was not someone living on the edge. She was a daughter, a student, an athlete, and a friend. She was 17 years old. An age when the future still feels endless. An age when dreams are not distant fantasies, but plans waiting to happen. Chelsea King believed she had time. She believed there would be more afternoons like this one. More runs. More conversations with friends. More moments with her family. More chances to discover who she would become. But on February 25, 2010, somewhere along the peaceful trails near Lake Hodges in Rancho Bernardo, California, that future was stolen from her. What began as a normal afternoon would become one of the most heartbreaking investigations in San Diego's history. A missing person case that would grip an entire community. A search that would bring together strangers, volunteers, law enforcement officers, and people who simply refused to give up hope. A case that would eventually reveal something even more disturbing than a single act of violence. It would expose a terrifying question that haunted thousands of people. How could someone who had already been identified as dangerous walk freely among ordinary people? And how many warning signs had been ignored before another innocent life was lost? For Chelsea's family, those questions would never truly disappear. Because when a loved one disappears, time changes. Minutes become unbearable. Hours feel endless. Every phone call brings a moment of hope followed by the fear of disappointment. Every knock at the door carries the possibility of answers. And every passing day creates a battle between what the heart wants to believe and what reality may eventually reveal. When Chelsea did not return home that evening, her family immediately knew something was wrong. This was not like her. Chelsea was responsible. She was someone who cared about the people around her. She was not the kind of person who would simply vanish without telling anyone. Her absence created a silence that felt unnatural. The place where she should have been was suddenly empty. Her messages went unanswered. Her phone could not provide reassurance. The normal rhythm of a family evening was replaced by fear and uncertainty. At first, everyone hoped for a simple explanation. Maybe something had happened to her phone. Maybe her plans had changed. Maybe she had stopped somewhere and would walk through the door at any moment. But as the hours passed, that hope began to weaken. Then came the discovery that transformed concern into panic. Chelsea's car was found near the Lake Hodges area. Inside were personal belongings that suggested she had not planned to leave. There was no clear explanation. No obvious reason why a 17-year-old girl would abandon everything and disappear. The vehicle sat there quietly, almost like a frozen image from an ordinary day. But Chelsea was missing. And that contradiction became the first terrifying clue. Something had happened. Something that had taken her away from the life she knew. The search began quickly. People across San Diego heard her name. They saw her photograph. They learned about a teenage girl who had gone running and never returned. For many, Chelsea became more than a missing person. She became someone they felt they knew. A daughter. A sister. A classmate. A friend. A reminder that tragedy does not always arrive in places where people expect it. Sometimes it appears on familiar paths. In peaceful neighborhoods. In places where families believe their children are safe. As investigators began searching the area around Lake Hodges, they faced the difficult reality of every missing person case. The first hours mattered. Every detail mattered. Every person who had been near the area mattered. The question was simple but terrifying. Where was Chelsea King? And who had been with her during the final moments before she disappeared? At the beginning of the investigation, there was still hope. Search teams moved through the area. Volunteers joined the effort. The community came together, refusing to accept that Chelsea might never come home. Her face appeared throughout San Diego. People shared her story. They searched trails and surrounding areas. They looked into places that most people would have walked past without a second thought. Every piece of land became a possible answer. Every piece of evidence became a possible path back to Chelsea. But behind the scenes, investigators were beginning to look at another possibility. A darker possibility. The possibility that Chelsea had not simply disappeared. The possibility that someone had taken her. And if that was true, time was no longer just important. Time was everything. Because the person responsible could still be nearby. The person responsible might have done this before. And investigators would soon discover that the name connected to Chelsea's disappearance was not the name of a stranger who had suddenly appeared from nowhere. It was the name of someone who had already been known to the system. John Albert Gardner III. A man who had already been convicted of a serious sexual offense. A man who had already served time. A man who was supposed to be monitored after his release. The discovery of Gardner's connection to the case would send shockwaves through San Diego. Because suddenly, the tragedy of Chelsea King was no longer only about one young woman who had been taken. It became a story about prevention. About responsibility. About whether a system designed to protect people had failed. Before Chelsea's name became associated with grief and tragedy, she was simply Chelsea. A 17-year-old girl with hopes and dreams. A young woman who enjoyed running. A student with a future ahead of her. Someone who had no reason to believe that an ordinary afternoon could become her last. That is what makes this case so painful. Because Chelsea's story did not begin with a crime. It began with life. It began with a girl who woke up that morning, unaware that the world around her was about to change forever. She had plans. She had people who loved her. She had a future waiting. And then, in a place that appeared peaceful and familiar, everything changed. The investigation that followed would uncover painful truths. It would reveal the actions of a dangerous offender. It would expose failures that many believed should never have happened. But before the courtroom battles, before the accusations, before the search for justice, there was only one thing that mattered. Finding Chelsea. Bringing her home. Giving her family the answer they desperately needed. In the beginning, San Diego held on to hope. Thousands of people believed that Chelsea would be found alive. They believed that somewhere, somehow, she was waiting to return. But as investigators moved closer to the truth, they would uncover a story far darker than anyone wanted to imagine. A story of a predator who had already crossed a line once. A story of a young woman whose life ended far too soon. And a story that would forever change how California looked at the way dangerous offenders were monitored after release. The name Chelsea King would become connected to heartbreak. But it would also become connected to courage. To a family's determination. To a community's refusal to forget. And to a lasting reminder that behind every crime statistic is a person. A real person. With dreams. With loved ones. With a life that mattered. This is the story of Chelsea King. A 17-year-old girl whose final run became the beginning of a case that would haunt San Diego forever. San Diego County is a place many people associate with sunlight, beaches, and a relaxed coastal lifestyle. It is a region where the ocean breeze moves through neighborhoods lined with palm trees, where families gather in parks on weekends, and where the idea of danger often feels distant. For many residents, San Diego represented safety. It was the kind of place where parents believed their children could grow up surrounded by opportunity. A place where teenagers could go to school, join sports teams, meet friends, and spend afternoons outside without their families constantly fearing what might happen. But beneath the peaceful surface of this beautiful Southern California community existed another reality. A reality where even familiar places could become the setting for unimaginable tragedy. The area where Chelsea King disappeared was not some abandoned, forgotten corner of the city. It was not a place people avoided. It was a place where people went to enjoy nature. The Lake Hodges area, located near Rancho Bernardo, was known for its scenic views, walking trails, and open spaces. The lake stretched across a landscape of hills, dry brush, and winding paths that attracted runners, hikers, and outdoor enthusiasts. For someone like Chelsea, it was exactly the kind of place that felt comfortable. A place to clear her mind. A place to exercise. A place where she could spend time outdoors. The trails around Lake Hodges carried the footsteps of countless people every day. Families walked there. Athletes trained there. People came to enjoy the quiet beauty of the landscape. The sun reflected across the water. The hills created long shadows as the day moved toward evening. The sounds of nature filled the area. To most visitors, it was peaceful. But on February 25, 2010, that peaceful environment became connected forever with one of San Diego's most painful memories. The contrast between the beauty of the location and the horror that occurred there made the case even more disturbing. A place that represented freedom and relaxation became a place associated with fear. A trail that once represented health and happiness became a place where investigators searched for answers. And for many people in the community, Lake Hodges would never feel exactly the same again. Before Chelsea King became known across the country because of tragedy, she was simply a teenager living an ordinary but meaningful life. She grew up surrounded by people who cared about her. She attended Poa High School, where teachers and classmates recognized her as someone with a positive attitude and strong character. Chelsea was not defined by one moment. She was defined by 17 years of experiences, relationships, and dreams. She was the type of person who brought energy into a room. Someone who participated. Someone who cared. Someone who had goals beyond high school. To those who knew her, Chelsea represented the promise of youth. She was at an age when life was beginning to open up. The world was becoming larger. The possibilities seemed endless. College was approaching. New experiences were waiting. The future was something she could imagine. Like many teenagers, Chelsea had a balance of responsibilities and simple joys. She studied. She spent time with friends. She stayed active. She enjoyed running. Running was not only exercise for Chelsea. It was something personal. A moment when she could be alone with her thoughts. A moment where she could challenge herself. For many runners, the rhythm of movement creates a sense of freedom. Each step becomes a reminder of strength and independence. For Chelsea, those familiar trails near Lake Hodges were part of her routine. There was no reason for her to believe that one afternoon would be different. There was no warning. No obvious sign that danger was waiting. That is one of the most haunting elements of the case. Chelsea did not make a reckless decision. She did not knowingly walk into danger. She was doing something completely normal. Something thousands of people do every day. She went for a run. While Chelsea's life represented innocence and possibility, another person connected to this story carried a much darker history. John Albert Gardner III had already entered the criminal justice system before Chelsea's disappearance. He was not an unknown individual with no warning signs. Years earlier, Gardner had been convicted in connection with a sexual offense involving a 13-year-old girl. That conviction changed the direction of his life. He became a registered sex offender. His name entered official records. His history was known. After serving his sentence, Gardner returned to society under supervision. But the question that would later haunt investigators, lawmakers, and the public was this: had enough been done to prevent him from committing another crime? The case of Chelsea King would force many people to confront uncomfortable questions about how society handles individuals who have already demonstrated dangerous behavior. A criminal record can document what someone has done in the past, but it cannot always predict what someone will do next. And when the person involved is someone who has already harmed another person, the consequences of failure can be devastating. Chelsea's death would transform a private tragedy into a public debate. A debate about monitoring. A debate about accountability. A debate about whether warning signs had been missed. In the days before Chelsea disappeared, nothing about San Diego suggested that a nightmare was approaching. People continued their routines. Students went to school. Families went to work. Runners continued using local trails. Life moved forward as it always had. That normality is what makes the events of February 25th so difficult to understand. The world around Chelsea did not change before the tragedy. The weather was ordinary. The location was familiar. The activity was routine. There was no dramatic moment announcing that something terrible was about to happen. Real tragedies often begin quietly. They begin in moments that look completely ordinary. A person leaving home. A vehicle parked in a familiar location. A phone call that never comes. A family waiting longer than expected. The first signs of danger often appear only after the opportunity to prevent it has already passed. As investigators later reconstructed the timeline, they would focus heavily on the environment around Lake Hodges. Every detail mattered. The location of Chelsea's vehicle. The trails she was known to use. The people who had been nearby. The possibility that someone had watched her routine. In criminal investigations, the location of a disappearance can reveal important information. A familiar place can become a map of possibilities. Who knew the area? Who understood the surroundings? Who could move through the location without attracting attention? These questions became increasingly important. Because the person responsible was not acting in a random environment. The area around Lake Hodges had characteristics that could make it appealing to someone looking for isolation. There were stretches of open land. Areas away from heavy traffic. Places where someone could disappear from view. For Chelsea, it had been a place of peace. For someone with harmful intentions, it became something else. As the search for Chelsea continued, the community began to change. The story moved from conversations between family members and investigators to the wider public. People who had never met Chelsea learned her name. They saw photographs of her smiling face. They imagined their own daughters, sisters, and friends. The case became personal. Because Chelsea represented something many people feared losing. The safety of everyday life. Parents began looking at their children differently. They began asking questions they never wanted to ask. How safe are the places our children visit? Who is watching? Who is responsible? The disappearance of one teenager created fear throughout an entire region. But it also created unity. People volunteered. They shared information. They searched. They hoped. In moments of tragedy, communities often reveal their strongest qualities. Compassion. Determination. The refusal to abandon someone. For Chelsea's family, however, the world had narrowed to one impossible question. Where was their daughter? Every hour without answers carried a heavier weight. Every possibility had to be considered. Every piece of information had to be examined. The beautiful landscape of Lake Hodges, once just another part of San Diego, had become the center of a desperate search. And somewhere within that landscape were the first clues to what had happened. Clues that would eventually lead investigators to a man whose past should have raised alarms. A man whose name would soon become known across the nation. John Albert Gardner III. But before the investigation revealed the truth, before the courtroom demanded accountability, there was still a family waiting. Still a community searching. Still a hope that Chelsea King would walk back through the door. Because in the first days of a disappearance, people hold on to the possibility of a miracle. They believe that the next phone call might bring good news. They believe that the next discovery might bring someone home. And for Chelsea's loved ones, that hope was the only thing standing between them and the unbearable reality that something far worse had happened. The search for Chelsea King had begun. And with every passing hour, the peaceful landscape of San Diego was slowly transformed into the center of one of California's most unforgettable criminal investigations. Before the photographs appeared on television screens, before strangers across California learned her name, before her story became connected to a painful chapter in San Diego's history, Chelsea King was simply a 17-year-old girl living a life filled with ordinary moments. She was not a symbol. She was not a headline. She was not a case file. She was Chelsea. A daughter. A student. A friend. A young woman standing at the beginning of adulthood, unaware that her life would become remembered not only for the tragedy that ended it, but for the joy and kindness that defined the years before. In the weeks and months after Chelsea's death, people who knew her struggled with the same impossible thought. How could someone so full of life be gone? How could a person who brought happiness to others suddenly become the center of a story filled with grief? For her family and friends, the answer was not found in the details of the investigation. The answer was found in remembering who Chelsea truly was. Because Chelsea's story did not begin on the day she disappeared. It began 17 years earlier. Chelsea grew up in a loving environment where family played an important role in her life. Those closest to her described a young woman who cared deeply about the people around her. She was someone who valued relationships, someone who understood the importance of friendship and loyalty. She had the qualities that many parents hope to see in their children. Responsibility. Compassion. Determination. She was the kind of teenager who was building an identity of her own while still remaining connected to the people who had supported her throughout her childhood. Like many young people her age, Chelsea was discovering who she wanted to become. She was learning what mattered to her. She was creating memories that, at the time, felt like they would continue forever. Because that is how life feels when you are 17. The future feels permanent. The next year feels guaranteed. The dreams you carry seem like promises waiting to be fulfilled. Chelsea had every reason to believe that her story was only beginning. At Poa High School, Chelsea was known as a student who worked hard and participated in school life. She was not someone who disappeared into the background. People noticed her. Not because she demanded attention, but because of the way she interacted with others. She had a positive presence. She had the ability to make people feel comfortable. For classmates and teachers, she represented the best qualities of youth. She was focused but approachable. Ambitious but kind. Competitive but supportive. Her life was not defined by one single achievement. It was defined by hundreds of small moments. A conversation between classes. A smile in the hallway. A joke shared with friends. A simple act of kindness that the person receiving it might remember years later. Those are the moments that make a person real. And those are the moments that her loved ones would hold on to after she was gone. One of the things Chelsea loved was running. For many people, running is simply a physical activity. A way to stay healthy. A way to train. A way to pass time. But for Chelsea, running represented something deeper. It was independence. It was focus. It was a chance to challenge herself. When someone runs, there is a unique connection between the body and the mind. The world becomes quieter. Thoughts become clearer. The simple rhythm of movement creates a feeling of freedom. Chelsea was familiar with the trails around Lake Hodges. She knew the area. She knew the route. She had gone there before. That familiarity was exactly why the events of February 25, 2010, were so difficult for people to understand. Chelsea was not entering an unknown environment. She was not doing something unusual. She was following a routine. A routine that should have been safe. A routine that should have ended with her returning home. To understand the tragedy of Chelsea King, it is important to understand the contrast between the life she was building and the future that was taken from her. At 17, Chelsea was standing at a turning point. High school was moving toward its final chapters. The next stage of life was approaching. There were decisions ahead. New experiences. New opportunities. The world was opening. She was preparing for adulthood, but she still carried the optimism of someone who believed that possibilities were everywhere. That innocence is one of the reasons her story affected so many people. Chelsea represented a generation of young people who believe the world is larger than their current circumstances. They make plans. They dream. They imagine the person they will become. They do not expect their lives to be interrupted by violence. They do not expect danger to find them during an ordinary afternoon. After Chelsea disappeared, the public saw her photograph everywhere. A smiling teenager. A young woman full of energy. A face that represented hope during the search. But behind that photograph was a complete human being. A person with favorite memories. A person with fears and dreams. A person whose family knew her laugh. Whose friends knew her personality. Whose absence created a silence that could not be replaced. For those who loved Chelsea, the hardest part was not only losing her. It was losing all the moments that would never happen. The conversations that would never take place. The achievements she would never celebrate. The experiences she would never have. A graduation. A career. Relationships. Future milestones. All the ordinary moments that make up a life. A future disappeared with her. As investigators searched for answers, the community searched for ways to describe the person they were trying to bring home. People shared stories about Chelsea. They talked about her kindness. They talked about her personality. They talked about the way she made others feel. In many missing person cases, the public first learns about someone through the circumstances of their disappearance. But Chelsea's story became different. People wanted the world to remember that she was more than what happened to her. She was more than the crime. More than the investigation. More than the name attached to a tragic case. She was a person who mattered before February 25, 2010. And she mattered after it. The tragedy surrounding Chelsea's death also created a painful contrast with the person responsible. Chelsea represented trust. Hope. Potential. Gardner represented the failure to protect that innocence. The difference between them could not have been greater. One was a teenager looking forward to the future. The other was an adult whose past had already shown dangerous behavior. This contrast would become central to the public's understanding of the case. Because the question was not only what happened to Chelsea. The question was why it happened. And whether it could have been prevented. As the investigation moved forward, Chelsea's family faced the unbearable experience of waiting. Waiting for information. Waiting for answers. Waiting for news that could change everything. For families of missing people, time becomes a cruel opponent. The mind creates possibilities. The heart refuses to accept the worst. Every unknown moment carries both hope and fear. Chelsea's loved ones had to live through that uncertainty before the truth was revealed. And when the truth finally came, it would change their lives forever. Years later, people would remember Chelsea King not only because of how she died, but because of how she lived. Her name became connected to efforts to protect others. Her story became part of conversations about criminal justice and public safety. But before she became a reminder of those issues, she was a teenager with dreams. A girl who enjoyed running. A student with ambitions. A daughter who was loved. The most important part of Chelsea King's story is not the moment when her life ended. It is the 17 years before that moment. The friendships she created. The people she influenced. The memories she left behind. Because tragedy can take away a future. But it cannot erase the life that came before. And for everyone who knew Chelsea, that life was something worth remembering. She was not just the victim of a terrible crime. She was Chelsea King. A young woman whose smile represented possibility. A person whose story continues because the world refuses to forget who she was. On February 25, 2010, San Diego looked exactly like the kind of place where people believed bad things happened somewhere else. The winter season was beginning to fade. The harsh cold that affected other parts of the country was thousands of miles away. In Southern California, the days were often bright, the skies wide and open, and the landscape carried the familiar beauty that attracted people to the region. For Chelsea King, it was just another afternoon. Nothing about the day suggested that it would become a date remembered with pain. Nothing about the morning hinted that a family's life was about to be divided into two separate chapters. Before February 25th. And after. Chelsea was 17 years old. She was living the life of a typical teenager with responsibilities, friendships, and dreams for the future. Like many young people, she had routines that provided comfort. Familiar places. Familiar activities. Familiar patterns that made everyday life feel predictable. One of those routines was running. It was something Chelsea enjoyed. It was something she had done before. The trails around Lake Hodges were not unfamiliar territory. She knew the area. She understood the paths. She was comfortable being there. That comfort was important. Because when people later looked back at what happened, one of the most painful truths was that Chelsea had not placed herself in an obviously dangerous situation. She was not chasing excitement. She was not ignoring warnings. She was simply doing something normal. She went for a run. That afternoon, Chelsea left home and traveled toward the Lake Hodges area. Like so many times before, she likely expected the run to be an ordinary part of her day. A chance to exercise. A chance to think. A chance to enjoy the outdoors. Her vehicle was later found near the area where she had planned to run. At first glance, there was nothing dramatic about the scene. No obvious sign that something terrible had occurred. Just a parked car. Just personal belongings. Just the quiet surroundings of a popular outdoor location. But one detail immediately stood out. Chelsea was not there. The vehicle remained. Her belongings remained. But Chelsea was gone. And that simple fact changed the meaning of everything. When Chelsea failed to return home, concern began to grow. At first, the people who loved her probably tried to find explanations. Maybe she had stayed longer than expected. Maybe she had lost track of time. Maybe something simple had happened. That is how families respond in the first moments of fear. The mind searches for ordinary answers because accepting extraordinary possibilities is too painful. A parent does not immediately think the worst. A family does not immediately imagine tragedy. They hope. They wait. They believe there must be a reasonable explanation. But as time passed, those explanations became harder to accept. Chelsea was responsible. She was someone who communicated. She was someone whose absence would be noticed. This was not normal behavior. Something was wrong. The first hours after a person disappears are often the most critical. Investigators know that every minute matters. Every decision matters. Every detail can become important. In Chelsea's case, the circumstances created immediate concern. Her car had been located. Her phone was unavailable. There was no clear indication that she had left voluntarily. There was no message explaining where she was. No goodbye. No warning. Only questions. Where had Chelsea gone? Who had seen her? Had someone followed her? Had someone been waiting? Those questions would soon become the center of a desperate investigation. As law enforcement began examining the area around Lake Hodges, the peaceful environment took on a different meaning. Places that had once represented recreation became potential evidence. The trails became search locations. The surrounding landscape became something investigators had to study carefully. Every path mattered. Every person who had been nearby mattered. Every possible witness mattered. The area was large enough to create challenges. Nature can hide details. Open spaces can create uncertainty. A place that feels welcoming during daylight can become completely different when investigators are searching for answers. Meanwhile, Chelsea's family entered a nightmare that no family ever wants to experience. The waiting. The uncertainty. The helplessness. There is a special kind of pain that comes from not knowing. When someone is gone, but there is no explanation, the mind becomes trapped between hope and fear. One moment, a family imagines the person returning. The next moment, they fear that something irreversible has happened. Every unknown sound creates a reaction. Every phone call feels like it could change everything. For Chelsea's loved ones, the search was not a police investigation. It was personal. It was their daughter. Their friend. Their loved one. The person they wanted back. As the case gained attention, the public began learning more about Chelsea. Her photograph was shared. Her story spread. The community responded with urgency. People wanted to help. Volunteers joined searches. Residents provided information. The disappearance of one teenager created a wave of fear and determination across San Diego. But as investigators looked deeper into the circumstances surrounding Chelsea's disappearance, they began considering a disturbing possibility. This might not have been a case of someone simply becoming lost. Someone might have caused this. And if someone had caused it, the most important question became, who? The answer would eventually lead investigators toward John Albert Gardner III. But before his name became associated with Chelsea's disappearance, he was already a person with a criminal history. Gardner had previously been convicted in connection with a sexual offense involving a young teenage girl. He had already entered the system. He had already been identified as someone who posed a potential danger. That history would later become one of the most controversial aspects of the case. Because Chelsea's disappearance was not only about what happened on February 25th. It was also about what happened before. The choices that were made. The warnings that existed. The protections that may or may not have been enough. For investigators, the challenge was now clear. They needed to understand Chelsea's final movements. They needed to reconstruct the timeline. They needed to determine whether someone had targeted her. And if so, how that person had gained access to her. Criminal investigations often begin with fragments. A vehicle. A phone. A location. A witness statement. A piece of physical evidence. Each fragment alone may seem meaningless. But when investigators connect them, a picture begins to form. In Chelsea's case, that picture would become increasingly disturbing. The days following her disappearance were filled with a painful contradiction. The community still hoped for a miracle. But investigators were preparing for the possibility of something much darker. Every search operation carried two different emotions. Hope that Chelsea would be found alive. Fear that the truth would be unbearable. For the people who loved her, the only acceptable outcome was her return. For investigators, the mission was to discover what happened. Even if the answer was painful. February 25, 2010, began as an ordinary day. A teenage girl left home. She went to a place she knew. She followed a routine she had followed before. Nothing about it seemed unusual. And that is what made the disappearance of Chelsea King so terrifying. Because the most devastating moments in life do not always announce themselves. They arrive quietly. They hide inside ordinary days. They transform familiar places into reminders of loss. By the time the sun went down over San Diego that evening, Chelsea was missing. Her family was searching. Investigators were racing against time. And a community that had once viewed Lake Hodges as a peaceful escape was now facing a terrifying reality. A young woman had vanished. And somewhere in the silence surrounding that disappearance were the first clues to a crime that would shock an entire nation. When the first reports of Chelsea King's disappearance reached law enforcement, every passing minute seemed to carry more weight than the last. Missing person investigations often begin with uncertainty. Sometimes people leave voluntarily. Sometimes they become injured while hiking or exercising. Sometimes there is a misunderstanding that resolves itself within hours. Investigators are trained to consider every possibility before reaching conclusions. But Chelsea's case felt different almost from the very beginning. There were too many questions. Too many pieces that did not fit together. And perhaps most importantly, too many people who insisted that this simply was not like her. Chelsea was dependable. She stayed in contact with the people she loved. She followed routines. She had responsibilities. She had plans. Everything about her life suggested that she would never intentionally disappear without telling someone. That understanding shaped the investigation from its earliest hours. The search around Lake Hodges quickly expanded. Law enforcement officers moved carefully through the network of trails, examining areas that an ordinary visitor would barely notice. Volunteers answered the call almost immediately. Some came because they had children of their own. Others because they had visited those same trails countless times. Many had never met Chelsea. Yet they spent hours walking across rough terrain under the California sun, believing that somewhere ahead they might find the clue that would bring a frightened teenager home. The search became more than an official investigation. It became a community effort. Neighbors stood beside strangers. Experienced search personnel worked alongside ordinary citizens. Every person carried the same hope. Find Chelsea alive. Bring her home. As the hours stretched into another day, the atmosphere slowly began to change. The initial energy remained, but it was joined by something heavier. Uncertainty. No one wanted to speak the fear aloud. No one wanted to imagine the possibility that the outcome might not be the one everyone prayed for. Families waiting for news often describe those hours as existing outside normal time. Sleep becomes impossible. Meals go untouched. Conversations become shorter. Every vibration of a phone causes the heart to race. Every unfamiliar vehicle stopping near the house becomes a reason to look through the window. Chelsea's family lived through every one of those moments. They answered questions. They spoke with investigators. They tried to remember every detail that might help. What had Chelsea been wearing? What route did she usually take? Who had spoken with her last? Had anything unusual happened in recent days? Every answer felt important. Every memory became another piece of a puzzle no family ever wants to solve. Meanwhile, investigators began documenting the area surrounding Chelsea's parked vehicle. The car itself told a troubling story. It suggested arrival. It did not explain departure. Her belongings remained where they should have been. Nothing about the scene suggested that Chelsea had chosen to leave everything behind. Instead, the absence itself became the strongest piece of evidence. She had reached the trail. Somewhere after that, something interrupted the ordinary course of her day. Search teams widened their efforts. Trails. Brush. Open ground. Areas near the shoreline. Every location had to be examined methodically. The landscape that visitors admired for its beauty now presented enormous challenges. Dense vegetation reduced visibility. Uneven terrain slowed progress. Natural features created countless places where evidence could be hidden. Investigators understood that missing even a small detail could delay the truth. As news coverage intensified, Chelsea's smiling photograph appeared across television broadcasts, newspapers, and websites. People who had never heard her name now recognized her face. Parents watched the reports with growing unease. Many looked at their own children differently. A routine jog. An afternoon walk. Activities that had always seemed harmless suddenly carried a new layer of anxiety. The case struck a nerve because it challenged a basic assumption shared by countless families. That familiar places are safe. That ordinary routines are predictable. That danger announces itself before it arrives. Chelsea's disappearance suggested otherwise. As tips began reaching investigators, each one had to be evaluated carefully. Some were promising. Others led nowhere. Witnesses remembered seeing runners, cyclists, dog walkers, vehicles entering and leaving parking areas. The difficulty was separating meaningful observations from ordinary daily activity. Hundreds of people passed through the area. Only one interaction truly mattered. Finding it required patience, precision, and persistence. Behind the scenes, forensic specialists examined every available piece of evidence. Physical evidence often speaks more honestly than memory. It cannot become confused by stress. It cannot unintentionally change over time. Even the smallest biological trace can establish connections that eyewitnesses cannot. The investigation increasingly relied upon science as much as interviews. At the same time, detectives started examining known offenders who lived within the region. One name quickly demanded closer attention. John Albert Gardner III. He was already familiar to law enforcement. His criminal history involving a sexual offense against a young teenager immediately elevated concern. Investigators could not ignore the possibility that someone with a documented history of predatory behavior might be connected to Chelsea's disappearance. Still, suspicion alone was never enough. Evidence would be required. The investigation continued on multiple fronts simultaneously. Search teams remained focused on locating Chelsea. Detectives pursued interviews. Forensic laboratories processed evidence with urgency. Time remained the enemy. On February 28, only 3 days after Chelsea disappeared, investigators reached a critical milestone. Evidence collected during the investigation established a significant connection between Gardner and Chelsea. DNA evidence became one of the most important breakthroughs. It provided investigators with objective scientific support that strengthened their suspicions. Law enforcement arrested John Albert Gardner III. For many members of the public, the arrest brought cautious optimism. Perhaps Chelsea would now be found. Perhaps investigators had reached the person who knew where she was. Perhaps there was still hope. But experienced detectives understood an uncomfortable reality. An arrest does not automatically bring answers. Sometimes it raises even more questions. Even after Gardner was taken into custody, the search continued. Chelsea had not yet been found. Her family still had no certainty. The community remained suspended between hope and fear. Then, on March 2, 2010, the investigation reached its most heartbreaking moment. Searchers located Chelsea King's body near the Lake Hodges area, not far from where her vehicle had originally been found. She had been buried in a shallow grave. The discovery ended days of desperate searching. It also ended every remaining hope that Chelsea might somehow come home alive. For the search teams, it was a devastating moment. Many volunteers had joined believing they were helping rescue a missing teenager. Instead, they became witnesses to the conclusion of a homicide investigation. For investigators, the discovery transformed the case. No longer was the primary objective locating a missing person. Now every piece of evidence surrounding the burial site had to be documented with extraordinary care. Every measurement, every photograph, every trace. The scene would become central to proving exactly what had happened. For Chelsea's family, however, none of those investigative steps could lessen the pain. The answer they had feared had become reality. Their daughter was gone. The waiting had ended. The uncertainty had ended. But certainty brought a grief that words could never fully describe. Communities often remember exactly where they were when major tragedies unfold. For many residents across San Diego County, the announcement that Chelsea had been found was one of those moments. People who had followed every update stopped what they were doing. Television broadcasts interrupted regular programming. Neighbors called one another. Parents embraced their children. The story that had begun with hope concluded with heartbreak. Yet even in that moment of overwhelming sadness, another realization emerged. Someone had done this. Someone had taken the life of a 17-year-old girl whose only plan that afternoon had been to go for a run. Justice would now become the focus. Investigators returned to every piece of evidence with renewed determination. Every forensic result. Every interview. Every timeline. Every movement connected to John Albert Gardner III. The goal was no longer simply to identify a suspect. It was to build a case so complete that the truth could withstand every challenge inside a courtroom. As detectives continued examining Gardner's background, they uncovered information that made the case even more disturbing. Chelsea might not have been his only victim. Connections began emerging to another missing teenager whose disappearance had remained unsolved for months. The investigation was no longer centered on a single tragedy. It was becoming something larger. Something darker. A pattern. For Chelsea's loved ones, however, the broader investigation could never replace what had been taken. They remembered birthdays. Family dinners. Conversations. Laughter. Plans for the future that would never become reality. Every family photograph now carried a different meaning. Every memory became more precious. The search that had begun with hope ended with unimaginable loss. But it also marked the beginning of another journey. A journey toward accountability. Toward understanding how this crime had happened. Toward asking whether it could have been prevented. And toward ensuring that Chelsea King would be remembered not only as the victim of a terrible crime, but as a young woman whose life inspired lasting change long after her final run had come to an end. By the time Chelsea King's body was discovered, the investigation had entered a different phase. The desperate search was over. Hope had given way to certainty. Now, every hour was devoted to understanding exactly how a 17-year-old girl had vanished from a familiar running trail in broad daylight. The investigators working the case understood that a homicide investigation is built one fact at a time. Assumptions have no place in a courtroom. Speculation cannot replace evidence. Every conclusion must be supported by something tangible. A witness. A forensic result. A documented timeline. A physical trace. The smallest overlooked detail could become the difference between justice and reasonable doubt. While the public already knew that John Albert Gardner III had been arrested, detectives still had to build a complete picture of what had happened. They returned to the Lake Hodges trails repeatedly. Crime scene investigators examined the landscape inch by inch. Photographs were taken from every possible angle. Measurements were carefully recorded. The burial site was documented with meticulous precision. Nothing was considered too small to preserve. Nature itself complicated the investigation. Wind moved across the dry brush. Animals traveled through the area. Days had passed since Chelsea disappeared. Every passing hour increased the possibility that fragile evidence might disappear forever. Investigators worked with extraordinary patience. The ground was searched carefully. Vegetation was examined. Objects that appeared insignificant to an ordinary observer were collected and analyzed. Each item represented another possible answer. Back at forensic laboratories, technicians processed biological evidence recovered during the investigation. Modern criminal investigations often depend upon science more than dramatic confessions. DNA does not rely on memory. It does not become emotional. It simply exists. In Chelsea's case, forensic evidence became one of the strongest foundations supporting the investigation. The DNA connection between Gardner and evidence associated with Chelsea provided investigators with objective confirmation that they were moving in the right direction. It transformed suspicion into a prosecutable case. Still, detectives wanted more than scientific confirmation. They wanted to understand the sequence of events. How had Gardner encountered Chelsea? Had he specifically targeted her? Was she chosen randomly? Or had he watched the trails long enough to recognize opportunities? These questions mattered because understanding offender behavior often helps investigators determine whether additional victims might exist. Behavioral analysts began examining Gardner's history alongside the circumstances surrounding Chelsea's disappearance. Certain patterns quickly emerged. His previous conviction had involved a young teenage girl. Now another young female victim stood at the center of a homicide investigation. Although every criminal case is unique, experienced investigators know that violent offenders frequently demonstrate consistent patterns over time. Victim selection. Methods of approach. Attempts to control victims. Efforts to conceal crimes. These recurring behaviors often become signatures that reveal how an offender thinks. Gardner's history immediately raised concerns that Chelsea's murder might not represent an isolated act. As detectives reviewed missing persons and unsolved violent crimes throughout the region, another name repeatedly surfaced. Amber Dubois. Amber had disappeared nearly a year earlier in Escondido while walking toward school. She had been only 14 years old. Her disappearance had devastated another California community. Despite extensive searches and countless investigative hours, her family had never received answers. For months, the two cases appeared unrelated. Different victims. Different locations. Different timelines. But detectives now recognized similarities that could no longer be ignored. Young female victims. Public outdoor environments. Sudden disappearances without obvious witnesses. The possibility that one offender connected both investigations became increasingly difficult to dismiss. Investigators quietly began comparing evidence from the two cases. Every document was reviewed. Every timeline examined. Every known movement of Gardner analyzed. Although much of this work occurred away from cameras and media attention, It represented one of the most important stages of the investigation. If Gardner was responsible for multiple crimes, understanding that pattern would strengthen the prosecution while providing long-awaited answers to another grieving family. Meanwhile, detectives continued interviewing people who knew Gardner. Neighbors, former acquaintances, employers, anyone who might provide insight into his behavior. These interviews rarely produce dramatic revelations. Instead, they build context. They reveal habits, daily routines, personality traits, movements that may appear ordinary until viewed alongside forensic evidence. Some individuals described Gardner as quiet. Others remembered interactions that, in hindsight, seemed unsettling. It is common after major criminal cases for ordinary memories to take on new meanings. Conversations once dismissed as awkward suddenly appear suspicious. Behavior once ignored becomes impossible to forget. Investigators carefully separated hindsight from evidence. Their responsibility was not to judge personality. It was to establish facts. At the same time, detectives reconstructed Gardner's movements during the days surrounding Chelsea's disappearance. Receipts, phone records, witness statements, vehicle locations, digital information. Every source contributed another piece of the timeline. Technology had become an increasingly valuable investigative tool by 2010. Cellular data, electronic records, surveillance footage were available. These silent witnesses often remembered details that human memory could not. Gradually, investigators assembled a clearer picture. It became increasingly apparent that Gardner had been present in the area at the critical time. Combined with the forensic evidence, the case against him continued to grow stronger. Yet investigators remained cautious. They understood that criminal prosecutions demand certainty. Defense attorneys examine every inconsistency, every unanswered question, every alternative explanation. The investigation therefore continued with remarkable discipline. Nothing was rushed. Every conclusion required verification. As detectives dug deeper into Gardner's background, another troubling issue emerged. His criminal history had not been hidden. Authorities had known about his previous sexual offense. He had been required to register as a sex offender. He remained subject to supervision following his release. These facts transformed the investigation into something larger than a single homicide. Questions about systemic oversight began surfacing. Could more effective monitoring have prevented another attack? Were warning signs overlooked? Had existing supervision been sufficient? These questions extended beyond the courtroom. They reached lawmakers, law enforcement agencies, parents throughout California. The investigation was now revealing not only what Gardner had done, but also the broader circumstances that allowed him to remain in the community. Public attention intensified. News organizations closely followed every development. Legal analysts discussed the evidence. Community members attended public meetings. Parents expressed fear. Outdoor recreation groups questioned safety on local trails. The emotional impact extended far beyond Chelsea's family. Thousands of people recognized themselves in her routine. A daughter going for a run. A teenager walking to school. A child enjoying everyday independence. The randomness of the crime made it deeply personal for countless families. For Chelsea's parents, however, public discussion offered little comfort. Every investigative breakthrough confirmed the painful reality they already faced. Their daughter would never come home. Still, they cooperated fully with investigators, determined to help establish the truth. Their strength became evident throughout the process. Despite unimaginable grief, they remained committed to ensuring that the person responsible would face justice. Weeks of investigative work eventually placed Gardner under overwhelming legal pressure. The forensic evidence. The reconstructed timeline. The growing connections to Amber Dubois. Each new discovery narrowed his options. The investigation was steadily removing every possible avenue of denial. Detectives understood that offenders sometimes continue resisting until confronted with the full weight of the evidence. Others eventually recognized that conviction is inevitable. Gardner's case was moving toward that point. But investigators wanted more than a conviction. They wanted answers for two families. Answers that had remained buried alongside years of pain. As prosecutors reviewed the growing case file, it became increasingly clear that they possessed one of the strongest homicide investigations in recent California history. Scientific evidence. Investigative documentation. Behavioral consistency. The pieces fit together with devastating clarity. Yet one chapter remained unfinished. The courtroom. Because evidence alone cannot deliver justice. It must be presented, examined, challenged, and ultimately accepted by the legal system. Soon, John Albert Gardner III would no longer face investigators searching for the truth. He would face prosecutors prepared to prove it. And inside the courtroom, another difficult decision would reshape the course of the case. One that would leave some people satisfied, others disappointed. But one that ensured Gardner would spend the remainder of his life behind prison walls, while two families continued learning how to live with losses that no verdict could ever erase. Every major criminal investigation reaches a moment when scattered pieces suddenly begin to fit together. For days, investigators had worked through thousands of details. Witness statements, forensic reports, search maps, laboratory analyses, phone records, vehicle movements. Each piece alone offered only a narrow view of the truth. Together, they began revealing a picture that became impossible to ignore. By early March of 2010, detectives no longer believed they were investigating a disappearance with multiple possible explanations. They believed they were closing in on a predator. The investigation had become a race to establish not only who was responsible, but how much they could prove. Although John Albert Gardner III had already been arrested, experienced investigators understood that an arrest is never the finish line. It is only the beginning of the legal battle. Evidence must survive scrutiny. Every fact must withstand cross-examination. Every conclusion must be supported beyond a reasonable doubt. That standard exists for an important reason. Justice demands certainty. In Chelsea King's case, detectives believed they were steadily reaching that certainty. The forensic evidence continued to strengthen the prosecution's position. Laboratory findings connected Gardner to evidence recovered during the investigation, reinforcing what detectives had begun to suspect almost immediately after focusing their attention on him. Science became the investigation's strongest witness. Unlike eyewitness testimony, forensic evidence does not become frightened. It does not forget. It does not change its story. It simply reveals connections that human observation cannot always detect. For prosecutors preparing the case, these findings became invaluable. But another breakthrough soon transformed the investigation even further. As detectives continued examining Gardner's background and comparing evidence from older unsolved cases, the disappearance of 14-year-old Amber Dubois moved to the center of their attention. Amber had vanished nearly a year earlier while walking toward school in Escondido. Her family had endured months of unanswered questions. Searches had produced no resolution. The case remained open, painfully unfinished. Now investigators began seeing similarities that could no longer be dismissed as coincidence. Both victims were young. Both disappeared suddenly. Both vanished in public outdoor settings. Both cases contained behavioral characteristics consistent with a sexually motivated offender. Although investigators remained careful not to jump to conclusions, they recognized that the probability of one offender committing both crimes was increasing. The possibility changed everything. If Gardner could be connected to Amber as well, investigators would not simply be solving Chelsea King's murder. They would be closing another heartbreaking chapter that had haunted Southern California for nearly a year. The investigation expanded. Detectives revisited every available record connected to Amber's disappearance. Old evidence received renewed attention. Timelines were re-examined. Known movements of Gardner were compared against historical information. Fresh eyes often see details that earlier investigations could not fully interpret. Criminal investigations are rarely linear. Sometimes answers emerge only because a later crime sheds light on an earlier one. That appeared to be happening now. Meanwhile, investigators continued interviewing Gardner. Like many experienced detectives, they understood that questioning is not always about forcing immediate admissions. It is about observing reactions, comparing statements, testing consistency, allowing evidence, not emotion, to expose contradictions. Individuals confronted with overwhelming forensic evidence often experience increasing psychological pressure. Every new fact removes another possible explanation. Every confirmed detail narrows the path toward denial. Gardner faced exactly that situation. The evidence continued accumulating. Investigators possessed forensic findings. They possessed timelines. They possessed behavioral patterns. The case against him was becoming increasingly comprehensive. Outside the investigation, public attention reached extraordinary levels. News organizations provided daily updates. Communities throughout California followed every development. Parents spoke openly about fear. Schools reassured families. Outdoor recreation groups reconsidered safety practices. Chelsea's disappearance had become larger than one criminal case. It had become a statewide conversation. People asked difficult questions. How could someone with Gardner's criminal history remain capable of committing another violent offense? Had supervision failed? Should laws governing registered sex offenders be strengthened? These discussions were emotional because they were deeply personal. Many parents recognized themselves in Chelsea's family. Their children participated in sports, walked to school, visited parks, went jogging. Ordinary activities suddenly seemed less certain. For Chelsea's parents, however, public debate remained secondary. Their focus remained fixed on one goal: truth. No legal proceeding could return their daughter. No investigation could restore the future that had been taken. But establishing exactly what had happened mattered. Not only for Chelsea. For every family whose child deserved protection. As prosecutors reviewed the enormous volume of evidence, they faced an important strategic decision. California law allowed prosecutors to pursue the death penalty in cases involving particularly serious murders. Given the facts surrounding Chelsea's death and the developing evidence connected to Amber Dubois, capital punishment remained a legal possibility. Preparing such a case, however, would require years of litigation. Appeals could continue for decades. Families often endure repeated court hearings, media attention, and emotional trauma throughout that lengthy process. Prosecutors therefore considered another option: a negotiated plea agreement. Such decisions are never simple. Some people believe every murder should proceed to full trial. Others believe certainty and finality better serve justice. The legal system must balance many competing interests: justice, evidence, victims' families, public safety. The likelihood of conviction. The emotional cost of prolonged litigation. In Gardner's case, the evidence gave prosecutors substantial leverage. As discussions continued between defense attorneys and prosecutors, one reality became increasingly unavoidable. The evidence was overwhelming. Eventually, John Albert Gardner III agreed to plead guilty. He admitted responsibility for the murders of Chelsea King and Amber Dubois. He also admitted responsibility for the sexual assault of another woman. Those admissions marked one of the most significant turning points in the investigation. For Chelsea's family, hearing those words could never ease their grief. But they eliminated uncertainty. No longer would there be questions about identity. No longer would there be speculation regarding the person responsible. The man who had taken Chelsea's life acknowledged his crimes. For Amber Dubois's family, the confession ended nearly a year of agonizing uncertainty. The answers they had desperately sought finally arrived, though at an unimaginable cost. Investigators later located Amber's remains after Gardner directed authorities to the area where he had concealed her body. That discovery brought another grieving family the opportunity to lay their daughter to rest. It was a heartbreaking reminder that solving one crime had uncovered another. For detectives, the investigation demonstrated both the strengths and the frustrations of modern criminal justice. Persistent investigative work. Careful forensic analysis. Patient interviews. Scientific evidence. Every discipline had contributed to revealing the truth. At the same time, the case highlighted painful questions about prevention. Could earlier intervention have stopped Gardner before Chelsea became another victim? That question continued echoing throughout California. The breakthrough in the investigation therefore carried two very different meanings. It delivered accountability, but it also exposed systemic vulnerabilities. The investigation itself was nearing completion. The truth had emerged. The offender had admitted responsibility. The families finally possessed answers. Now the legal system faced its final responsibility: determining the punishment. Inside a courtroom, prosecutors would present the devastating consequences of Gardner's actions. Chelsea King's life. Amber Dubois's life. The lasting trauma inflicted upon another survivor. The grief carried forever by parents who had expected to watch their daughters grow into adulthood. The investigation had uncovered the facts. The breakthrough had revealed the truth. The next chapter would determine how justice would respond to crimes that had forever changed two families, two communities, and the state of California itself. By the spring of 2010, the investigation that had consumed detectives, forensic scientists, prosecutors, and an entire community had reached its final stage. The search was over. The evidence had been collected. The truth had emerged. Now the case would move from the wooded trails of Lake Hodges into a courtroom, where facts would replace speculation and where the law would determine the consequences for the man responsible. Courtrooms are often imagined as places of dramatic confrontations. Movies portray emotional outbursts, shocking revelations, and unexpected twists. The reality is usually quieter, more deliberate. Every document is examined. Every statement matters. Every decision carries lasting consequences. In the case of Chelsea King, the courtroom was not only a place of legal judgment. It was a place where two families would once again confront the unimaginable reality that their daughters would never return. For Chelsea's parents, walking into the courthouse required a kind of strength that few people ever have to find. Just weeks earlier, they had still been hoping their daughter would come home. Now they were preparing to hear the legal details surrounding the person who had taken her life. Nothing could prepare a parent for that moment. No amount of time. No amount of advice. No amount of support. Grief does not disappear simply because legal proceedings begin. It follows every step. Every hearing. Every document. Every glance across the courtroom. John Albert Gardner III entered those proceedings no longer as a suspect but as the defendant in one of California's most closely watched criminal cases. The evidence assembled against him was overwhelming. Investigators had built a case supported by forensic science, physical evidence, witness testimony, and months of meticulous investigative work. The prosecution stood in an exceptionally strong position. Yet one significant question still remained. Would the case proceed to a lengthy capital murder trial? Or would another resolution be reached? California law allowed prosecutors to seek the death penalty under the circumstances presented in Gardner's case. The murders of Chelsea King and Amber Dubois had shocked the public. Many believed the crimes deserved the harshest punishment available. Public emotion was intense. Newspapers discussed the possibility daily. Television commentators debated what justice should look like. Community members expressed anger that someone with Gardner's criminal history had remained capable of committing such devastating crimes. At the same time, prosecutors carried responsibilities extending beyond public opinion. Their objective was not simply to pursue the maximum punishment. Their responsibility was to secure justice in a way supported by evidence and law. Lengthy death penalty trials often continue for years. Appeals can last decades. Families repeatedly return to courtrooms, reliving painful memories every time another hearing is scheduled. The emotional cost can be enormous. After careful negotiation, prosecutors and defense attorneys reached a plea agreement. John Albert Gardner III agreed to plead guilty. The admissions were comprehensive. He accepted responsibility for the murder of Chelsea King. He admitted murdering 14-year-old Amber Dubois. He also admitted sexually assaulting another woman in a separate attack. In exchange for those guilty pleas, prosecutors agreed not to pursue the death penalty. Instead, Gardner would receive multiple life sentences without the possibility of parole. The agreement generated mixed reactions. Some believed it represented the most practical path toward justice. Others wished to see a full trial and a possible death sentence. Reasonable people reached different conclusions. But for the families, one important reality remained. The guilty plea eliminated uncertainty. There would be no argument over identity. No prolonged attempt to deny responsibility. The man who had destroyed 2 young lives stood before the court and admitted what he had done. Court proceedings involving crimes against children and teenagers often carry a silence unlike any other. The legal language remains formal. The procedures remain structured. Yet beneath every sentence lies immeasurable human loss. Photographs entered into evidence no longer represented simply exhibits. They represented daughters. Children. Lives interrupted forever. As prosecutors outlined the case, they described the investigation that had unfolded over weeks. The disappearance. The search. The forensic evidence. The discovery of Chelsea's body. The connection to Amber Dubois. The admissions made by Gardner. Each fact formed part of a larger story. A story of violence. A story of loss. A story that had forever altered countless lives. Members of Chelsea's family sat through those proceedings carrying memories far removed from legal documents. They remembered birthdays, school events, family vacations, ordinary evenings spent together. The courtroom described the end of Chelsea's life. Her family remembered everything that came before. That contrast exists in nearly every homicide trial. The legal system focuses on the crime. Families remember the person. One speaks in evidence. The other speaks in love. Victim impact statements became among the most emotional moments of the proceedings. These statements allow families to explain what cannot be measured by forensic reports or sentencing guidelines. How does a parent describe the absence of a child? How do siblings explain growing older without someone who was supposed to grow old beside them? How do friends describe birthdays celebrated with an empty chair? There are no perfect words. Only honest ones. Chelsea's death had taken far more than a single life. It had changed the emotional landscape of an entire family forever. Amber Dubois's family carried the same burden. For nearly a year, they had searched without answers. Now they finally knew the truth. Knowledge ended uncertainty. It did not end grief. The courtroom united two families through shared tragedy. Neither had chosen this path. Neither could leave unchanged. Gardner himself remained remarkably unemotional throughout much of the legal process. Observers often searched his face for visible signs of remorse. Some believed they saw little emotion. Others cautioned against interpreting expressions alone. Courts do not sentence facial expressions. They sentence actions. And Gardner's actions had already spoken with devastating clarity. On May 14, 2010, the court imposed its sentence. John Albert Gardner III received consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole for the murders of Chelsea King and Amber Dubois, along with additional prison time for the other offenses to which he had pleaded guilty. The practical meaning of the sentence was unmistakable. He would spend the remainder of his life in prison. He would never again walk freely through another neighborhood. Never again visit another public trail. Never again have the opportunity to harm another young woman outside prison walls. For many people, the sentence brought relief. Not because it erased the past. Nothing could accomplish that. But because it guaranteed protection for future potential victims. Justice, however, is a complicated word. For courts, justice means accountability under the law. For investigators, it means solving the case. For prosecutors, it means proving guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. For grieving families, justice often carries a different meaning. Justice cannot restore birthdays that will never be celebrated. It cannot replace conversations that will never happen. It cannot return futures that were stolen. Chelsea King would never graduate into the life she had imagined. Amber Dubois would never return to her family. Those losses existed beyond the reach of any legal sentence. Yet the courtroom accomplished something profoundly important. It established truth. Officially. Permanently. History would never remember Chelsea King's case as an unsolved mystery. It would remember that the person responsible had been identified, confronted, and held legally accountable. As the proceedings concluded, another chapter quietly began. The legal case had reached its end. But the broader impact of Chelsea's death was only beginning. Questions raised during the investigation about supervising convicted sex offenders continued spreading through California. Lawmakers listened. Communities demanded change. Chelsea's parents, despite unimaginable grief, found the strength to advocate for reforms designed to protect other families from experiencing the same heartbreak. Their daughter's story would not end inside a courtroom. Instead, it would become the catalyst for changes reaching far beyond the walls where Gardner received his sentence. The verdict closed the criminal case. It did not close the wound. Some wounds become part of the people who survive them. They learn to live with the pain, not because it becomes smaller, but because life demands that they continue moving forward despite carrying it. For Chelsea King's family, the pursuit of justice had reached its legal conclusion. The journey of remembrance, however, was only beginning when the courtroom doors finally closed, reporters packed away their cameras, attorneys returned to their offices, and investigators slowly began moving on to the next cases waiting for them. For the public, the story appeared to be over. The suspect had confessed. The sentence had been imposed. Justice, at least in the legal sense, had been delivered. But for the people who loved Chelsea King, nothing had truly ended. The trial had answered the question of who. It had answered the question of how. It had even answered the question of where. Yet it could never answer the question that echoed through every quiet evening inside their home. Why Chelsea? There is no courtroom capable of explaining why one family loses a daughter while another family returns home safely after an ordinary afternoon. There is no verdict that explains why two teenagers with bright futures happened to cross paths with a violent predator. Some questions survive every investigation. Some remain unanswered forever. For Chelsea's parents, grief did not arrive all at once. It changed shape with time. In the beginning, there had been panic. The desperate hope that she would somehow be found alive. Then came heartbreak. The unbearable confirmation that their daughter would never walk through the front door again. After that came silence. Not the silence of an empty courtroom. The silence inside a family home where one voice was suddenly missing. Her bedroom remained. Her belongings remained. Photographs still covered shelves and walls. Every familiar object became a reminder that someone who should have been there was gone. People often imagine grief as constant tears. In reality, grief is quieter than that. It appears unexpectedly. A birthday that arrives without celebration. A graduation ceremony where one chair remains empty. A holiday gathering where everyone instinctively looks toward a place that will never again be filled. The absence becomes part of everyday life. Chelsea's family would carry that absence forever. Yet they made a remarkable decision. Instead of allowing tragedy to become the final chapter of Chelsea's story, they chose to transform their pain into purpose. Almost immediately after the legal proceedings concluded, conversations began across California about the supervision of registered sex offenders. The investigation had revealed a fact that disturbed millions of people. John Albert Gardner III was not an unknown predator. He had already been convicted of a serious sexual offense years before Chelsea disappeared. Authorities knew who he was. His name existed in official records. He was required to register as a sex offender. The question became unavoidable. If society already recognized that he posed a danger, why had another family been forced to experience such devastating loss? That question reached far beyond San Diego. It reached lawmakers in Sacramento, law enforcement agencies, victims' advocacy organizations, community leaders, parents, teachers. People who had never met Chelsea nevertheless felt connected to her story because it challenged something fundamental. The belief that systems designed to protect vulnerable people should work before another tragedy occurs, not afterward. Chelsea's parents became determined advocates for change. Speaking publicly while carrying unimaginable grief required extraordinary courage. Every interview meant revisiting painful memories. Every public appearance required discussing the daughter they had lost. Yet they continued. Not because it became easier, but because they believed another family should never experience what theirs had endured. Their efforts helped build momentum for legislative reform. The result became widely known as Chelsea's Law. The legislation strengthened penalties for certain sex offenses involving children and expanded supervision requirements for some registered sex offenders after their release. Supporters argued that stronger monitoring and harsher consequences could reduce the risk of repeat offenses by individuals considered especially dangerous. The law became one of the most significant public legacies connected to Chelsea's life. For many people, it represented something larger than legislation. It represented a family's refusal to allow unimaginable loss to disappear into history without creating meaningful change. Of course, laws alone cannot eliminate violent crime. No legal system can promise perfect safety. Human behavior remains unpredictable. But legislation can reduce opportunities. It can strengthen oversight. It can address weaknesses identified through painful experience. Chelsea's law reflected an effort to learn from tragedy rather than simply mourn it. Meanwhile, another family was also trying to rebuild life after unbearable loss. Amber Dubois's parents had spent nearly a year searching for answers before Gardner confessed. For months they had lived inside uncertainty. Not knowing where their daughter was. Not knowing what had happened. Not knowing whether she might somehow still be alive. The confession ended those questions. It also confirmed their worst fears. Their grief followed a different timeline from Chelsea's family, but the destination was the same. 2 daughters. 2 futures stolen. 2 families forever connected by one offender. The broader community also changed. Parents across Southern California became more cautious. Running trails once viewed as peaceful places now carried different associations. Schools reviewed safety discussions with students. Outdoor recreation groups encouraged people not to exercise alone whenever possible. These changes reflected a simple truth. One crime can permanently alter how an entire community views everyday life. Lake Hodges itself became different. The landscape had not changed. The hills remained. The water reflected the same California sunlight. The trails continued winding through the natural surroundings. Nature had no memory. People did. Visitors walking those paths after 2010 often remembered Chelsea. Even those who had never met her recognized the location. The place had become inseparable from the story. That transformation happens after certain tragedies. A physical location becomes part of collective memory. No sign announces it. No monument is required. Memory alone changes the meaning of a place. For investigators who worked the case, Chelsea's murder left lasting professional lessons. Experienced detectives often carry pieces of their investigations long after files are closed. Some cases fade with time. Others remain unforgettable. Cases involving children and teenagers frequently belong to that second category. Because investigators are not immune to emotion. They simply learn to continue working despite it. Many later reflected upon the extraordinary cooperation between agencies throughout the investigation. Local police, county investigators, federal resources, forensic laboratories, search volunteers. Each contributed something essential. No single individual solved the case alone. Justice resulted from hundreds of people performing their responsibilities with patience and determination. The investigation also reinforced the growing importance of forensic science. DNA evidence had played a decisive role. Modern criminal investigations increasingly rely upon technology capable of revealing connections invisible to the human eye. Scientific evidence cannot replace dedicated investigators. But together they create a powerful pursuit of truth. Years passed. News coverage gradually faded. New stories replaced old headlines. The public's attention moved elsewhere. That is the nature of news. Families, however, do not move on according to news cycles. They carry memories every day. Chelsea remained present in conversations. In photographs. In anniversaries. In acts of remembrance. Her story continued to inspire scholarship funds, community events, and advocacy efforts dedicated to protecting others. For many young runners, Chelsea became a symbol of determination and resilience. Not because of how her life ended, but because of how fully she had lived before tragedy interrupted it. Her name represented kindness, ambition, energy, hope. Those who knew her wanted the world to remember that before remembering the crime. Perhaps that is the greatest challenge in every true crime story. Avoiding the temptation to let violence become the defining feature of someone's life. Chelsea King was never defined solely by the man who murdered her. She was defined by 17 years of compassion, friendship, hard work, and love. The crime explained how her life ended. It did not explain who she was. As California continued discussing criminal justice reform, public safety, and offender supervision, Chelsea's name remained part of those conversations. Not as a statistic. Not as a headline. But as a reminder that every law carries a human story behind it. Every reform begins because someone paid an unimaginable price. Chelsea's family understood that reality better than anyone. They could never choose what happened on February 25, 2010. But they could choose what happened afterward. They chose courage. They chose advocacy. They chose to ensure that their daughter's name would forever stand not only for heartbreaking loss, but also for hope that future lives might be protected because of the lessons learned from hers. And in that decision, Chelsea King's story became something larger than a criminal case. It became a legacy long after the courtroom had emptied and the headlines had begun to disappear from newspaper front pages. The Chelsea King case continued to cast a long shadow over California. Some criminal cases end with a verdict. This one did not. The legal proceedings concluded. The prison sentence became final. The investigation was officially closed. Yet the questions left behind continued to grow. Not because investigators had failed. Not because the courts had failed to identify the person responsible. But because this case forced people to confront an uncomfortable truth. Sometimes justice arrives only after prevention has failed. That realization lingered in the minds of detectives, lawmakers, journalists, psychologists, and countless parents who had followed every development from the beginning. The central question remained painfully simple. Could Chelsea still be alive if earlier warning signs had led to stronger intervention? There was no answer that could satisfy everyone. Some argued that no supervision system can predict every future crime. Others believed that individuals with histories of serious sexual offenses required much closer monitoring after release. Between those positions existed a difficult reality. Modern criminal justice systems must constantly balance punishment, rehabilitation, constitutional rights, and public safety. Finding that balance is never easy. Chelsea's case became one of the examples studied whenever those difficult discussions returned. It was no longer only a criminal investigation. It had become part of a broader conversation about responsibility. Criminologists examined the case closely. Not because it was unique in every detail, but because it illustrated several recurring patterns seen in repeat violent offenders. One of the most significant observations involved escalation. Violent criminal behavior often does not appear without warning. Many offenders demonstrate troubling conduct years before committing their most serious crimes. The earlier offense committed by John Albert Gardner III had already revealed an attraction to vulnerable young victims. That history mattered. It demonstrated that Chelsea's murder did not emerge from nowhere. It followed an established pattern of predatory behavior. Behavioral experts often explain that patterns are among the most valuable tools available to investigators. Human behavior tends to repeat itself. Offenders develop methods, preferences, routines. Even when circumstances change, underlying motivations frequently remain consistent. Gardner's known criminal history fit that principle with disturbing clarity. His victims were young. They were isolated. They were selected when opportunities presented themselves. These similarities became important not only during prosecution but also during later academic discussions surrounding offender risk assessment. Psychologists studying violent crime also focused on another aspect of the case: Opportunity. Not every violent offender spends every moment searching for a victim. Instead, many crimes occur when motivation and opportunity unexpectedly intersect. Lake Hodges offered both familiarity and isolation. The trails attracted individuals exercising alone. Large sections of the area provided limited visibility from nearby roads. Visitors came and went throughout the day. Most experienced nothing except a peaceful afternoon outdoors. For Gardner, investigators believed the environment offered something entirely different. Opportunity. This understanding transformed the way many communities evaluated public recreation areas. Safety discussions increasingly emphasized awareness without encouraging unnecessary fear. Running clubs encouraged exercising in groups. Families discussed sharing locations with loved ones. Parks reviewed emergency communication practices. These were not guarantees against crime. They were practical responses to lessons learned through tragedy. For Chelsea's friends, however, academic discussions and legislative reforms remained distant concerns. They remembered someone entirely different from the person described in legal documents. They remembered a classmate who laughed easily. Someone who encouraged teammates. Someone whose enthusiasm often brightened ordinary days. Graduation season arrived without Chelsea. Her classmates continued moving forward into adulthood. Colleges welcomed new students. Careers slowly began. Families grew. Life continued. Yet for many who had known her, there was always an awareness that someone should have been sharing those milestones beside them. That is one of grief's quietest forms. The recognition that life continues even when someone important can no longer experience it. Chelsea would never celebrate those future achievements. Her friends carried both gratitude for their own opportunities and sadness for the future she never received. Meanwhile, investigators occasionally reflected upon how narrowly cases can unfold. Had one piece of evidence been overlooked? Had one witness failed to come forward? Had forensic science been less advanced? The investigation might have taken much longer. Modern homicide investigations often depend upon the combination of dedicated police work and rapidly developing forensic technology. Neither succeeds consistently without the other. Chelsea's case demonstrated that partnership remarkably well. Persistent detectives asked difficult questions. Forensic specialists answered many of them through science. Together, they established the truth. Law enforcement agencies also used the investigation as a learning experience. Training programs later referenced aspects of the case when discussing missing person responses, evidence preservation, interagency cooperation, and offender management. Each major investigation leaves behind lessons. Professionals study those lessons carefully because future lives may depend upon them. True crime stories often focus almost entirely on offenders. People remember names associated with violence. They analyze motives. They examine criminal histories. Chelsea's case reminds us why that approach can become unbalanced. The most important person in this story was never the offender. It was Chelsea. She was the reason detectives worked around the clock. She was the reason volunteers searched miles of rugged terrain. She was the reason forensic scientists rushed laboratory testing. She was the reason prosecutors prepared an exhaustive legal case. She was the reason her parents later dedicated themselves to protecting other families. Everything else followed because one young woman's life mattered. Her legacy gradually became larger than the crime itself. Students learned about Chelsea's law without always knowing every detail of the investigation that inspired it. Parents shared safety conversations with their children because they remembered her story. Communities organized awareness events. Scholarships honored her memory. These acts did not erase sorrow. They transformed remembrance into action. There is a meaningful difference. Remembering alone looks backward. Action looks forward. Chelsea's family chose both. Years after the case concluded, journalists occasionally returned to interview investigators or review the lasting impact of the legislation inspired by Chelsea's death. Nearly every conversation returned to the same observation. No one wanted Chelsea's name to be remembered only because of tragedy. Those who loved her wanted people to remember the 17 years that came before February 25, 2010. The runner. The student. The daughter. The friend. The young woman whose future had seemed limitless. That perspective matters. Because crimes steal enough from victims. They should not also steal their identities. As time passed, the physical evidence from the investigation was archived. Court records entered permanent legal history. Official reports found their places inside secured files. But memory does not enter storage. Memory continues living inside families. Inside communities. Inside people whose lives intersected with Chelsea's, even briefly. Some wounds heal. Others become part of who we are. The Chelsea King case belongs to that second kind. Not because people refused to move forward, but because moving forward did not require forgetting. It required carrying the memory differently. With sadness. With gratitude. With determination. Looking back, it becomes clear that February 25, 2010, changed far more than one family. It changed conversations throughout California. It influenced legislation. It shaped law enforcement practices. It encouraged communities to think differently about public safety. Most importantly, it reminded countless people that ordinary days should never be taken for granted. A routine run. A goodbye at the front door. A promise to be home soon. These moments often seem too ordinary to notice. Until one day they become the last memory someone has. Chelsea King never knew that the afternoon she left for a run would become the final chapter of her own story. But because of the people who loved her, because of investigators who refused to stop searching, and because of a community determined to learn from unimaginable loss, her story became something far greater than the crime that ended it. It became a lasting reminder that behind every investigation is a life worth remembering, a family forever changed, and a responsibility shared by all of us to build a safer future for those who follow.